Welcome to the Tomorrow's World Today podcast. We sit down with experts, world-changing innovators, creators, and makers to explore how they're taking action to make tomorrow's world a better place for technology, science, innovation, sustainability, the arts, and more.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Tomorrow's World Today. And today I have the pleasure of having David Harding here. He has quite a long title, so I think I'm going to read that today. He is Senior Vice President of Pipeline Product Management at Abbott. Wow. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much, George. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Well, we were looking forward to meeting you because there are a lot of new developments going on in your industry, and I thought it would be great for us to hear about this innovation that you're involved with. Can you talk a little bit about cancer screening and how it's going to change fundamentally in the future?
George, as you know, today we screen for 4 cancers, right, as a standard of care. We screen for cervical cancer, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, and for high-risk individuals for lung cancer. But that's only 4 cancers. There are many other types of cancers that can happen to us, right? And so we want to be able to screen for many more cancers, right? Today, we only screen for about 30% of the cancers that are ultimately found in the United States. We want to be able to open that up and screen for those 70% of other cancers that are occurring, just as symptomatic or in some other way, so that we can really advance the detection of cancer.
So you've recognized that there's a challenge. There are so many different cancers out there. Yes, there are individual ways of doing it, but apparently there's another method that's going to reveal a way to better diagnostic all these other cancers. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so just recently we launched a test called Cancerguard, and that test is a simple blood test that can potentially identify 50 different types and subtypes of cancer. And it's you get it as a prescription from your doctor, healthcare provider. You get your blood drawn, they send it to our lab, and we analyze it to identify, potential signals of cancer that may exist in your body.
That's a major improvement over the past. I mean, if you look at the history of cancer and whatnot, I mean, it used to be there's a lump, what's this all about? And now you're going into the blood and find this problem before it really turns into a major problem.
From my own personal experience, I know how important this is. About 14 years ago, my wife found a lump under her armpit, and we went in and had it diagnosed and biopsied, and it turned out to be stage 4 melanoma.
Oh, my goodness.
And, we didn't have a lot of options at that point, right? She had immunotherapy that helped her for a period of time. It made her feel better, and it slowed the progression of the cancer. But ultimately, about 18 months later, after, lots of therapy, lots of surgeries, and a lot of pain, she passed away. So, detecting those cancers earlier, right, before they get to stage 4 is so vitally important.
I'm sorry to hear that, David, but I can see why this work is so important to you now.
That has been a prime motivator for me to be involved in cancer screening for the last 20 years.
Hopefully it's going to help a lot of people in the future, right?
Yes, indeed. That is the aim.
All right. Well, can we talk a little bit, broadly speaking, about the work that's going on at Abbott to try and figure out how to do this?
So we've been developing this test for about 10 years, right? We've been taking the best knowledge from leading academic medical centers, and we've been incorporating this into a very simple blood test that, can identify a couple of different types of signals in your body that are indicative of cancer presence. So we look at 2 particular biomarkers. One of them is cancer-associated proteins. The other is what's called a methylated DNA marker. And I can explain a little bit more about what that means.
Please do.
Okay.
I think our audience would need a little more explanation.
So let's imagine that you have a cancerous tumor developing in your body, right? That cancer is going to have cells that break down and die. The DNA that's within those cells gets shed into the bloodstream. Right? So if we can find those minute fragments of DNA in your blood and identify them as being associated with that cancer, then we can say, hey, there is one signal, right, that is associated with cancer that might potentially indicate that you've got a cancer. The other thing that a tumor does is it throws off proteins, right, specific kinds of proteins. And again, when we examine your blood, we can identify those proteins and say, hey, there's a cancer-associated protein in your bloodstream. Between those 2 signals, we can identify whether a tumor might be present.
Wow. So I imagine behind the scenes, a lot of people trying to figure all this out, right?
Yes.
And let's say in laboratory conditions, research and development, how many people are we talking about working on this behind the scenes to finally come to a conclusion that you could take this approach to the blood and find this advantage?
Yeah, I mean, over the course of time, we've probably had about 250 people working on it at any given time. And again, that's been over a 5-6 year period that we've been working on this. So a lot of folks in a lot of disciplines coming together to make this happen.
You know, I think a lot of people just don't really understand the amount of effort it takes. You know, once you identify a problem, well, is that an opportunity, or is that just something that's going to stay in academia for a while? But to make a commitment financially, hire the right people, get into that lab, start identifying a better way to do something. We understand that very well here, and I think this is a very interesting development. So let's talk about when we draw the blood, what happens next?
Yeah, so that blood is drawn, right? You either get that blood drawn, in your provider's office, or we can send somebody to your home to get that blood drawn. That'll be sent off to our lab in Madison, Wisconsin. It will be processed and analyzed. First of all, in a laboratory environment, and then we take these signals that we identify in the laboratory and we put them into an algorithm, right, that is able to look at all these different signals and determine whether you've got, a positive case or a negative case, right? In the case of a positive, we would say, hey, you need to get further evaluation and diagnosis to confirm that there is a cancer there or rule it out. If it's negative, you go back into your regular screening protocol. So, go back to getting your mammogram, your colorectal cancer screening like Cologuard or colonoscopy, or doing your pap testing as the case may be. So, we want to make sure that people continue to stay up to date with their standard of care screening in addition to getting this multi-cancer early detection through Cancerguard.
It sounds like the process is becoming so much easier for the general consumer to participate in this. It makes sense that people are going to check more often. Yes. Is that what we're starting to see? Are you getting indicators from the market that consumers are starting to see this as a strong advantage?
Absolutely. When we listen to individuals that go into their doctor's office, right, many of them are asking, hey, doc, I know you can screen for these 4 cancers that we typically screen for, but what about all the other cancers that are out there, right? What about pancreatic cancer and ovarian cancer and some of these other very aggressive cancers that, that people hear about and get worried about because they see their friends, having these cancers and really being impacted by them. So there is a very large demand for getting this alternative type of screening that can really broaden the spectrum of cancers that are detected. People are going in, they're asking their doctors about it, and we're making it as easy as possible to get that testing.
I like that whole concept of what's going on here. But I need to ask you a few more questions about, your path in life. I mean, you're in what you do as a pipeline product management person.
Yeah.
So can you walk me through what that means so the audience understands what your responsibilities are?
Yeah, I mean, in essence, I lead the entire multi-cancer early detection business at Abbott. But more specifically, that means working with the R&D teams to understand how the technology is evolving. It means working with our laboratory teams to build all the machinery and mechanisms and processes so that we can routinely and accurately test people. It means working with our IT systems folks because we're getting a lot of information from the blood. We have to process that, put it into algorithms, and then make sure that those test results get back to patients in an efficient manner. It means working with manufacturing folks who build the chemicals and reagents that are able to identify these small pieces of DNA and these proteins in the bloodstream. And then it means working with product and marketing teams that will allow us to not only design and configure the product, but also communicate it effectively out to potential patients and individuals who will use the test. So it's really a broad-based team that we're orchestrating here to bring all this wonderful product to life.
That makes a lot of sense. So you're communicating between all these different pods of technical developer type people, everything from marketing to R&D.
Yep.
And at any one of those steps, if anything comes apart, it's a problem. It extends your launch to market. It creates, so you kind of go in there and smooth out the bumps and figure out a way to get people to get the job done.
Yeah, really what we're doing is trying to identify problems and then figure out ways to solve them together. So, it is about being creative in that problem solving. It's about being curious about what could possibly be done better and how do we keep innovating. So it really is about building that teamwork and a joint problem solving approach.
Sounds like good leadership all the way around, so well done. So let's talk about Cancerguard in particular now. Can you talk about how it works so our audience can come to understand this new process, technology, innovation?
Yes. So again, going back to, you've got a potential tumor in your body, right, and shed these little pieces of DNA that are highly associated with that cancer, right? And we're going to go in there and we're going to detect those pieces of DNA and as well as the proteins that are associated with that tumor. Again, it goes through that laboratory process. We identify how strong that signal is, right? Do we have a strong enough signal to say, yes, indeed, we believe you have a cancer signal in your bloodstream, right? If we do, and the data supports that, we will, basically say, hey, that looks like a cancer signal detected. It's a positive signal. So in that case, right, the patient would go to their doctor, their primary care physician, or other healthcare provider, and we do kind of a thorough workup of that patient, right? We want to take a look at their blood. We want to understand their personal history and if there are any personal risk factors. And then we're going to send that patient into full body imaging, right? So that we can scan your body, kind of neck to thigh and see if there's anything in there, right, that looks like a cancer. And, once we've done that, we can definitively identify where that cancer is located and then off to treatment.
So David, who might benefit from Cancerguard?
Generally, we say individuals who have other risk factors, they might be considered at their physician's discretion. So things like, hey, you have a familial risk of cancer or maybe some environmental exposures that might predispose you to cancer, right? At your physician's discretion, you might also consider Cancerguard.
Is there ever a possibility in the future that maybe I could draw my own blood at home and send it to the company and have them analyze it?
It requires a fairly large amount of blood, so there are systems where you can sort of attach a little button to your arm and get a small amount of blood, but this requires a venous blood draw, and so it needs to be done by a phlebotomist.
Okay, so we're still going in there.
We're still, yes.
Because sometimes the wait in the office isn't something you want to sit through, right?
Yes, indeed.
All right, so how do we explain the signal in blood to a patient?
Yeah, again, I think it's easiest to basically say, look, there is a tumor there, right? If there's a tumor there, it is going to be shedding biomarkers into the bloodstream, right, that sort of give us a clue that there is cancer there, right? It's either those small fragments of DNA that are coming out from dying cancer cells, or it's the proteins that are being shed by that tumor that are very specific to that particular tumor type, right? So that's what constitutes the signal that we're looking for.
And if we were to go back in time and say, somebody's doing analysis, but somebody came up with the idea to identify, what's floating in the blood there as a dead cell.
Yeah.
And do you have the history on how, where did that idea come from? Was there a particular person that came up with that concept, or how did that come about?
I mean, there are two scientific founders that are very closely associated with our product. One of them is Dr. David Ahlquist from the Mayo Clinic. The other one is Dr. Bert Vogelstein from Johns Hopkins University. And those two individuals, in different ways and in different times, conceptualized this idea of we should be screening for many more cancers than we are today. They were also real pioneers in identifying some of these biomarkers that we know are highly associated with cancer. And so I can't give you the deep history of each of their academic progress, but those two and their associated laboratories were really, really important in identifying these particular biomarkers and how they are connected to cancer.
Yeah, I'm just curious. Our audience is it's a curious type of audience that we have, and I wish it's almost like, don't you wish you could be there with Thomas Edison when he's in the lab and figuring out all that? It would be very interesting to be in the lab conditions with those two gentlemen and coming up with the idea of, well, maybe there's something floating in the blood, and if we could identify that, that might be something that we could standardize and identify. That to me would be a great moment to be a part of.
Yes, I can only imagine, and I've been privileged to meet both of those gentlemen, and they are really remarkable innovators and pioneers in their spaces.
Yeah, it's great to see their ideas are now scaling and going to help everybody. So that's hats off to those guys.
Yes, indeed.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more about how do you address the fear factor that patients may have that would be hesitant to do a screening like this?
Yeah, I think it's very natural for patients to feel a little bit of apprehension when you're going in for any kind of medical test, right? You're never sure quite what, the outcome is going to be from that. And I would say to that, yes, totally, understand that anxiety. I would also say, George, we live in a world where, as we're driving around in our cars, right, we have all sorts of systems that are telling us, hey, you're too close to this car, there's something in your blind spot, or look out for this, or look out for that, right? It's good that we have that knowledge, right? It helps us to avoid accidents.
Yes.
And I think similarly for our health, we want to have as many signals as we can, right? As many warnings as we can that will help us to identify potential risks to our own health. And so, when I think about this type of cancer screening, I say, wouldn't you rather know? I mean, I think back to my own personal experience, right? Wouldn't I have rather known that my wife had stage 2 disease rather than finding it at stage 4?
Yes.
Because when I have it at stage 2, I have a lot more options. I have a lot more ways to treat. I have a lot more flexibility, and I have a lot more time. So this is all about giving more knowledge to more individuals so that they can be proactive about managing their health.
Yeah, I like that analogy, because you're right. I mean, the cars today, they feed us all these signals.
Yeah.
It's so natural now.
Yeah.
It makes sense. Yeah, I don't know. I've never been a person that goes to the doctor's office and gets nervous about things. I just have this trust factor, I think, is what it is.
Yes.
But I do know some people that are scared to go in. Yeah. And I don't know, maybe they think there's something going on naturally.
Yeah, and I think, they are worried, but, we also provide, services that will help a person who has a positive test kind of navigate through the next set of processes, right? So as part of our service, we say, hey, if you're positive, we have a care navigator that's going to help you make sure you get the right care from your clinician that gets you to the next steps of imaging, and that will also be there to talk you through any anxiety that you're having, right? Because this is as much a mental anxiety thing as it is anything else. And so those care navigators are there to, help us work through that process if, in fact, we do have a positive patient.
And I've had blood drawn, too. I mean, when we donate blood, it's not painful.
Yeah.
I'm not afraid of that situation. We've done that for ages.
Yeah.
And is it similar to that same kind of, is that how they're getting blood out of the body and for analysis?
Yep, it's very similar to your routine blood work that you would do for any other medical test. So, we're drawing your blood in a very similar way.
So there you go. Fear factor should go down, right? All right, well, let's take another question or two here. So we've covered early detection by pulling the blood. What do you think is the most important advice that you could give anyone looking to get into your field?
I would just say be curious and study a lot of different things. I started as an engineer in the aerospace world. I evolved into business, and then ultimately that led me to medical technology. But I would say just study a wide variety of things, right? Whether it's medicine, engineering, biology, history, right? I mean, all of those things are really, really important. And then learn how to work with and lead people. That is probably the most important thing, right? Is just learning how to be a good problem solver and a good leader.
So, and how many people are you responsible for at Abbott?
Oh, gosh. I mean, directly reporting to me are only 8 people, but, I have a very broad team of, over 250 people whose efforts I'm trying to coordinate on a day-to-day basis.
So the leadership principle of how you get things accomplished, that falls on your platter.
Yes, exactly.
So I agree with you. I think it's stay curious, explore different fields, because it's very interesting. You started in engineering.
Yes.
So you have a mathematical mind, and then you've applied it in other ways that now you're in leadership now.
Yes.
So that journey is I think that's a good life, right? Staying curious and trying to figure it out as you go, but stay educated and see where your life can take you.
Gives you a lot of variety, right? If you can do lots of different things throughout your life, lots of different challenges, it's very, very fulfilling.
Yeah, it sounds as though you found yourself in a place where, you're chasing a noble goal, a noble cause, right? If you can make a good impact on people's lives, it's probably pretty easy for you to get out of bed in the morning and go to work.
Absolutely. I'm highly motivated by this. And, I'm motivated in particular by a story of one of our colleagues who took the Cancerguard test when it was first available. She was kind of otherwise healthy. She got a positive Cancerguard test and was worried, of course. She was a little bit nervous. She went in to see her doctor. They did a CT scan and found a fairly large tumor on her ovary. Luckily, as they went in and biopsied it, they found that it was just a stage 1 tumor, right? Terrific, right? Terrific outcome. And through a simple surgery, she is now completely free of cancer, right? So it took about 8 weeks from the time she got a positive Cancerguard test to the time that she was fully cancer-free. And this is the kind of story, right, and the kind of impact that we can have when people get tested for cancer using the Cancerguard test. And it's the kind of thing that makes me supremely motivated every single day.
Yeah, I imagine so, and probably for everyone on your staff too.
Yeah.
They know they're making a contribution, right?
Yes.
Something to get up and go do every day.
Yes, indeed.
Make progress. So thank you for that. From the field of invention and moving it through the process of, thought of an idea to building a prototype to manufacturing and then out into marketing. Can you talk a little bit about how the inventing process works at Abbott and how an idea comes to see the day, light of day?
Yeah, I mean, in this case, we started with an idea that was developed in an academic laboratory, an academic medical system. And, we licensed some of that technology and acquired a smaller company that had been built off of some of those technologies. We also have very deep partnerships with our academic partners, and so we're collaborating with them in those early phase discoveries, right? And then we look at those problems and we say, okay, where is there a need, right? Where is there an unmet medical need that we can potentially solve with this technology? So it starts with what's possible, right? And what's doable from a biological standpoint. And then it goes to where is the need, right? Among patients, among clinicians, and how do we solve that need? And then ultimately those things kind of come together. We build the technology, we harden it, we make it scalable and put it in our laboratory in Madison, Wisconsin, where we can test millions of people theoretically. And then we research it, right? So, this all doesn't come without, a deep set of data that surrounds it. So there's a ton of research, there's a ton of experimentation that takes place, and then we ultimately have to try it out on, samples from human beings and see if it works. We do that, we get confident that we have a proof of concept and that we've demonstrated it with sufficient robustness, and then we start rolling it out to, actual live human subjects and see where that data takes us from there. We can then move to commercializing that. So that's the overall process.
So David, I was curious about, how Cancerguard is going to get commercialized from this point.
Yeah, it's a really great question, George. First of all, what I want to say is this test is what we would call a lab-developed test, right? It's certified by our laboratory according to certain regulations. It is not yet FDA approved,
okay.
So it's important to note that. But in terms of the commercialization, we are out in the market now, and we do that in a couple of ways. First of all, we have a very large sales team that's calling on healthcare providers, right? Think about your primary care provider. We have a team out there that's educating those providers on what the Cancerguard test is and broadly what multi-cancer early detection is and why it's important. We also have teams calling on health systems so that health systems are prepared to interface with potential Cancerguard patients. And, we also have a lot of web capability where we're educating patients on the web. Patients can even come in and order directly on Cancerguard.com through our telehealth providers. So those are the ways that we are educating consumers and healthcare providers as well as health systems to be able to manage these patients and really respond to the big demand that's out there.
Knowing that, I think I'm curious too about how do we explain the benefits of what this can do, and also, what some of the risks might be. How do you cover that with a brand new product?
Yeah, it's really important that we start with, what's the problem we're trying to solve, right? We're trying to screen for the 70% of cancers for which there is no standard of care screening today, right? That's big problem number one. Then we talk about, okay, Doc, wouldn't it be great if you could offer a solution to your patient that would allow them to detect these cancers and detect them earlier, where you can really start to treat them effectively? And so That's really the way that we start the education process. And similarly for consumers, we would ask a very simple question, right? Wouldn't you like to be able to screen for all these different types of cancers for which there is no screening available today, right? To really be proactive about your health, or to respond to a situation where you might have heightened family risk, right? Maybe you have some relatives or direct relatives that have had cancer, or maybe you've been exposed to environmental influences that might make you more susceptible to cancer, right? Any of those risk factors might make you more appropriate for the Cancerguard test.
I see. So like in the, just in the medical device field,
yeah.
We, in our invention land, we're involved with that industry. And whenever something's coming out, it's getting commercialized, usually there's like a government's involved with all sorts of regulatory oversight and that kind of thing. So, and sometimes you have to say certain words and phrases to make sure there's awareness. Is there anything that we would want to cover about, this product?
Yeah, for sure. We want to be clear that as of right now, this is a lab-developed test, right? It is not approved by the FDA at this stage. And, we generally say, hey, this is for people between the ages of 50 to 84, or individuals who may have a heightened risk, either a family risk, a genetic risk, or some other environmental risk for cancer. We will, as we move forward, do more studies that will eventually, we hope, get us to an FDA approval for this product.
Nice. So the commitment's there to get it done.
Absolutely.
So you're going to move, next you'd move to scale.
Yes.
You go to a factory, you have to mass produce, financial engineering, etc.
Yes.
So from a financial funding perspective, it's great to have an idea or an invention, but if you can't put that process all the way through and get financed properly, chances are pretty dim that you're going to see the light of day at the end of the...
Yeah, and medical technology development is a long process, right, as we've seen, right?
Yes.
I mean, it was sort of like 10 years from idea to, full commercialization in the case of Cancerguard. And that's typically the case for a lot of technology. So you have to have that important financial backing to be able to make those investments over a long period of time. And we're very fortunate to have that.
Curious about how that comes down at Abbott. So you've got a board of directors, you've got a group of folks. How does capital get allocated so that you can go make this magic happen? Is that a board decision? Is that a divisional decision you make? How's that happen?
Well, we're relatively new to the Abbott family, and so I can imagine, what that looks like, but I will tell you how it has been historically, right? We basically say, hey, we've got a technology proof of concept, and we have an idea that we think can make a big impact for patients and for human health. With those two arguments, right, we go to our senior leadership, we go to our board and say, hey, we would like to invest in this project. We think it's going to take about this long, and it's going to take about this much. And we get that investment, and that investment is kind of given to us over periods of time as we deliver against our milestones and demonstrate more and more that this is a viable product. So it's a stage-wise set of commitments, but it requires courage, and it requires a big commitment up front to say, hey, we're going to take this big problem on.
Right. You better believe in it.
Yes.
And in the days of that emerging area, were you involved with telling the story of what could happen here and to bring them to bear investing? Were you a part of that?
Yes. We originally acquired a company called Thrive a number of years ago. I was a part of that diligence team that brought that technology on. But since then, as I've been leading this business, every 6 months, every year, right, we're asking for more investment. We're asking to make it bigger and better and more robust. And so, yes, we have to continue to tell the story, continue to talk about the patient impact that we can have, and that's how it gets done.
Yeah. I want to thank you for being here with me today.
It's my pleasure.
Well, everybody, that's another edition of Tomorrow's World Today. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much.
See you next time, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Tomorrow's World Today podcast. Join us next time as we continue to explore the worlds of inspiration, creation, innovation, and production. Discover more at tomorrowsworldtoday.com, connect with us on social media at TWT Explore, and find us wherever podcasts are available.